So, you just stepped into the world of Total War Warhammer 2, and perhaps it's the first Total War game that you're ever playing. You find battles challenging and you don't really know what's going on or what exactly you're supposed to be doing. Well, this guide is hopefully going to help you understand some of the fundamentals of the game, so you know what you need to do to win and how to avoid losing. I can't possibly cover every aspect of the game in one video, there's simply too much, but I'll link a bunch of useful other videos at the end of this one. So, let us begin. So firstly, as you may or may not know, there are a total of 15 main factions in Warhammer 2. Many different races, many different playstyles, all of these armies are unique and different from each other, meaning they're all going to play slightly differently. And that's something you need to learn whether you want to play as the faction or whether you're fighting the faction. Which I know sounds very daunting, right? There's a lot to learn with all of these different factions and all their different playstyles. But it's not as bad as it seems because there is a lot of links between the factions and over time you'll naturally learn them anyway. And these factions are made up of different units, around 30 to 40 per faction. These units have different roles on the battlefield. Some are good at doing damage, some are good at simply staying alive, some are there simply to be sacrificed for the greater good. Take Chaos Marauders for example, a cheap infantry that isn't going to do a lot because they're not very tough and don't do a ton of damage. Or Chaos Warriors, much tougher, they can hold a line really well and grind down their enemies over time. Or the Chosen, they're incredibly tough and can deal out some serious damage against the right kind of targets. So we can unofficially categorize these units by their tier. Some are low tier units, mid tier units, high tier units, depending on how good they are, usually indicated by how expensive they are. And you see this in all kinds of units in all factions. Take the High Elves Cavalry. We've got Illyrian Reavers, the low tier option. They're not very expensive and not super tough or super damaging. And then in the mid tier you have the Silver Helms. They can do some good damage and are fairly tough. If you want to go all the way up to the high tier though, you can get the Dragon Princes, who are very tough and can do a hell of a lot of damage. So you see, we've got three different main tiers of the game: low tier, mid tier, high tier. But just because something is a lower tier doesn't mean it's not any good. Illyrian Reavers are still a good cavalry even though they're cheap and a low tier. They just have a different role from the other two cavalries. They're very fast, so they're good at flanking, good at chasing after missile units and things like that. They can still do a hell of a lot of damage, you just have to be a bit more selective about the targets that you choose to attack. So all the different sections of an army, infantry, missiles, cavalry, whatever, have different tiers of units, but not every faction has all tiers of all kinds of unit. For example, the Beastmen, they only have low tier missiles, they simply don't have a mid-range or high tier option. Whereas the Skaven have the opposite. They've got tons of different options. They've got loads of different low tier options, loads of mid tier options, and a bunch of high tier options. And then there's the poor old vampire counts who have no ranged options at all. And this overall is what gives the factions their identities and different playstyles. For example, the Bretonnians have weak infantry. Rarely will they be the ones winning you the battle. They've got some okay missile options, but their real strength is in their cavalry. The Greenskins though have great infantry and they can very often lead you to victory. They've got some average to okay missiles, but their cavalry isn't very strong overall, unless you bring it in high numbers, but they do have some good options, but generally it's a weaker part of their army. The Chaos, they have strong infantry but very little in the missile department, so it's a weak area for them. They do have some strong cavalry options, but they're very expensive, so overall it kind of gives them an average look on their cavalry. But these are just rough ideas of the different sections of a few armies to hopefully illustrate the point that all the factions have different strengths and weaknesses, creating the unique and varied factions and their approaches to battle. So what is it then that makes all the different units low tier, mid tier or high tier? Well, it's all in the stats. On the unit card to the left, you can see all the different stats and abilities and traits, which indicates the unit's role and how it's best to use them. The more expensive a unit is, the higher stats it has, and thus the higher tier of unit it is. But of course there is a lot of variables. The size of the unit, how many models are actually in it, the HP of the unit, how much health it has, any traits on the stats themselves, and the abilities at the bottom of the unit card. All of this comes together to show you what kind of unit this is and which enemy units it's going to be best at taking on. Just to make sure we understand these stats, let's quickly go through them. Armor, first of all, should be fairly self-explanatory. The more armor a unit has, the tougher it generally is. Leadership, this is the morale of a unit, their psychology, how tough is their mind. Lower leadership units are likely to rout and run away far sooner than high leadership units. Speed, another fairly self-explanatory one, how fast a unit moves across the battlefield. Faster units are generally better for flanking, such as cavalry and monsters. Melee attack, the stat that determines your unit's chance to hit. The higher this number is, the more damage they potentially do, basically. Melee defense, this is a unit's chance to dodge attacks and not take damage. The higher this number is, the better they are at staying alive for longer. Units with low melee defense can often be quite squishy. And then we have weapon strength, which is basically how hard a unit can hit. The more weapon strength they have, the more damage they're going to do. You can also see whether they have more armor piercing damage or base damage, which indicates which kind of target they should be going after more. But we'll talk about that more in a second. And lastly, we have charge bonus. This is basically extra damage that your unit can do to the enemies, but only if you click attack orders on them and they enter their charge animation. Upon contact, they'll get some bonuses to their damage. So that's all the basics of the stats. There are different combinations of them that you want to look out for. I've got videos on this which I'll link at the end. Once you learn to read these, it is fairly simple to pick up on what a unit is really for. So it's good to start paying attention to the unit cards to try and give yourself an idea of what that unit is supposed to be doing. So when all of that is understood, then you can start to think about what the game is really about. The matchups, which units are fighting each other, and what the outcome is going to be. It's all honestly very predictable. Once you get to know your units, you can look at two units fighting and go, okay, my unit is going to win here, or my unit's going to lose. You can make predictions fairly accurately. Like here, we've got Chosen with great weapons, an absolute anti-infantry high-tier murdering bunch of bastards, fighting the Silvering Guard, a mid-tier anti-large unit. They're best off fighting cavalry and monsters more than infantry. So naturally, we can predict this is a bad matchup for the Silverin, and they are going to get severely smashed by the Chosen. But if you put the Silverin in a matchup that they're suited for, they will be in a good matchup and they will do well. Silvering Guard versus Chaos Knights with Lances here. Chaos Knights are way more expensive, but this is the kind of target that the Silvering Guard want. And they are able to beat the far more expensive unit because this is their good matchup that they should be looking for. So Silverin, bad matchup against the Chosen, but a good matchup against the Chaos Knights. And all units have this. The Chaos Knights, bad matchup with the Silverin, but a good matchup for them with the Swordmasters of Hoeth, provided that they use their mobility advantage by cycle charging. They can charge in, hit this unit to do some damage, and then get out of there, and then go again, and keep hitting them, and they'll be able to do lots of damage to the enemy whilst not taking too much damage themselves in return. Cavalry generally trumps infantry unless it's anti-large or has a defense against their charges. And as for the Swordmasters of Hoeth, well, they're the ones to take on the Chosen potentially. So you can see it all goes round in a kind of very loose game of rock, paper, scissors. Certain units are strong against one unit but weak against another, or maybe somewhere in between. And these matchups mostly stay predictable unless other things get involved, like missiles, artillery, magic, abilities. These can change what might be the scissors to the paper and give the paper the advantage somehow. Some matchups, like the Swordmasters versus the Chosen, is a very even fight though. The Swordmasters can win, but they'll take such a pounding themselves in the process that it's really a Pyrrhic victory, and they've lost most of their health as well. Do understand though that units are adaptable. Like Trolls here, while they're best off fighting infantry, that's kind of their primary target, they can take on some secondary targets and still do good work as well. Like a Dragon for example. Not the best thing for them to be going after, they're not an anti-large unit, but they hit so goddamn hard that they can beat the crap out of a Dragon pretty effectively. Or maybe some Cavalry. Again, not their primary target, more of a secondary target, but they can still do some good work on that. It's not wrong to use Trolls to fight Cav. Unless it was maybe anti-large, then it might be bad for them. But just understand that units need to be flexible to maybe fight something that isn't the best matchup for them, but isn't a bad matchup, so it's still kind of okay. So you can kind of think about it like primary targets, these are the best matchups for your units. Secondary targets are ones that they can do okay against, but isn't really the best for them, but it's not really a bad losing fight for them. And then simply bad matchups, which is a losing fight, which is what we need to avoid if we want to win. Let's look at this on a grander scale. A full battle with two full armies, with lots of matchups going on all the time, all across the battlefield. That's what Total War battles are. Lots of matchups, you've got to try and control them to get most of the good matchups. Me knowing my units, knowing the Greenskins, knowing the Dark Elves, I can predict the outcome of most of the matchups that might happen. For the Greenskins, there's Black Orcs up front, great anti-infantry unit that will absolutely smash these Dreadspears that they're facing without a doubt. There's no question there, if it's a straight up 1v1, Black Orcs win. So playing the greenskins, I know that all I need to do is charge forward, attack those dread spears, and if I get those clean matchups, it's a nice easy win on the front line for me. All good matchups for my Black Orcs. But what if I was the Dark Elf player? I could see this coming and go, oh scheisse, I'm going to get the crap beaten out of me on the front line, I need to do something. Well, then you can look to other units in your army to support. There's 3 units of Dark Shards here. Strong armor-piercing missiles. Great for the armor-piercing because Black Orcs are heavily armored and they don't have a shield, so they are very susceptible to being blasted to pieces. So I'm going to focus fire down one of those units. I've also got the Haganeth Executioners, basically the same unit as the Black Orcs, so they can take them on in what will be a fairly even matchup, but still will take out some Black Orcs. We've also got our Lord on a Dragon. He's got a nasty breath attack, so we're going to let this unit of Black Orcs come in, attack my Dread Spears, and when they're stood still, we're going to come from the side, hit them with a breath attack, and it's going to wipe out most of that Black Orc unit, hopefully allowing my Dread Spears to win. If not, we can dive down into melee as well. And then there's this unit on the end where we've kind of run out of resources, but that's okay. We've turned 3 of our losing matchups into winning matchups, and we're just going to have 1 losing matchup. So you can see we've got to turn it around. If we've got bad matchups coming our way, we've got to find a way to make them work for us. Over on the left here, there's 4 units of Orc Boar Boys. Not a very dangerous cav, they're quite cheap, but they're facing 2 units of Cold One Knights. This is probably a fairly even fight. I'm not exactly sure who would win this. I would say the Orc Boys just for the sheer numbers and the flanking they could do, but we could make this a winning matchup for the Dark Elves, because over this side, we've got 2 units of Cold Ones fighting in a Ragnarok. That's probably a bad matchup for the Cold Ones, even though they're anti-large. Cav tends not to do great against single entities, and plus we've got some better ways to deal with it. So we could bring this Cav over to this other side with all the Orc Boys, and then we've got 4 units of Cold Ones versus 4 units of Orc Boys, and that is a guaranteed win for those Cold One Dark Elves. So again, we've turned potentially a losing matchup into a guaranteed winning matchup on that left side with all the Cav. And then, well, we've got that Ragnarok left unchecked though, so what's he going to do? It's likely going to charge up and maybe try to flank us. It could come into these Dread Spears, but they're an anti-large unit, so they can take it on a little bit, but not if those Black Orcs are smashing them in the face. Maybe they'll come after the missiles, but that's fine. We've got 2 other missile units. Once they're finished with the Black Orcs, they can turn their attention to all blast away at that Ragnarok Spider. 3 units of armor-piercing Dark Shards will take down an Ragnarok quick time. So we've got answers. There's a lot of bad matchups for us from this Greenskins army, but we've got answers to it. We've just got to find them and use them. That's how you win at Total War. There's some missiles here. Maybe these will shoot at the Dark Shards though. That might mess up the plans. There's Wurzag here. He might have a Foot of Gork, a very strong explosion magic spell. That could take out the Haganeth Executioners. That gives me 1 up back on my Black Orcs again, because now they're going to have a winning matchup. The Dragon could come along though. He might go after Wurzag, which will take Wurzag out of the fight. But he is protected by a big boss, is Wurzag, and some missiles, so maybe they'll be able to take down the Dragon. Maybe the Cav will come around and start to get after the Dark Shards or into the front line. Who knows? There's so many different possibilities of what could happen, but the aim of the game is very simple. Try to get more good matchups than the enemy does. Whoever gets more wins, basically. If it's fairly even, it'll probably be a pretty close fight. If you're to lose a battle though, it's guaranteed that it's going to be because you let too many of your units sit in bad matchups and they all caught a beatdown. If your units are in good matchups, you don't really need to do anything, just let them do their work and they'll win. But if you see your units in bad matchups, you will need to do something about it, unless you're maybe sacrificing that unit for the greater good, which sometimes is necessary. But for the most part, you've got to keep your good units doing work, being in good matchups. That's how you win battles. The simplest way to look at it is to look at the matchup between the 2 units and ask yourself, is this worth it? Am I going to do more damage to the enemy than they're going to do to me? If the answer is no, then you're probably going to lose that matchup unless you do something about it. Get some missiles, artillery, cav charge, magic, abilities, whatever you can do to help your unit turn that matchup around. And this is all true for campaign or multiplayer. Whichever way you're playing, the aim of the game is to get more of your units in good matchups doing more damage to the enemy than they're doing to you. Simple, eh? So Total War is basically a big game of rock, paper, scissors, chess. The one who can impose their will more and get more of the good matchups that they need will win. So just remember that all units have a primary target that is the best matchup for them. They'll have secondary targets which they'll do okay against, but it's still not a bad matchup, so it's okay. And then they just have straight up bad matchups, which you want to avoid. So that's all Total War really is. 2 armies trying to get the best matchups to secure the victory. In multiplayer, this is where the battle really is with this sort of thing, but in campaign it's happening too, but the AI isn't so good at putting its units in good matchups or taking itself out of bad ones. Once you get good at knowing the units and knowing matchups, you can actually start to predict the outcome of battles and how hard they're really going to be for you. Here I've got some Nordland boys attacking my Norscan settlement, And I can see they've got a lot more ranged units than I have. Some artillery, I've mostly got infantry, so I'm going to have to rush them if I want to have a chance. We can take a look at the enemy army and see what's going on. I can notice that there's 3 mortars. This is a good matchup for them against any of my units that they can blow up with them. So I need to counter that somehow. I've got some warhounds. They're perfect for taking out artillery. They're fast and they'll munch them down nice and quick. I've also got a bunch of units on this left side which are going to try and push around to get behind the front line and deal with that artillery and any missiles. So the good matchup for the enemy of them having missiles to shoot me with and artillery to blow me up with, I can counter by getting a hold of those units and beating the crap out of them. I've got the units to do that. My front line is just going to come forward and take on whatever they've got for now. There's some skirmish cav here, pistoliers. I'm going to take them on with my skirmish cav. Marauder horsemen, this is probably quite an even matchup between the two, pistoliers and horsemen. Maybe a slight advantage to the pistoliers, but I'm okay with that. It's only a very slight losing matchup if anything, so not a big deal to me. My front line is marauders. We can take a look at what they're going to face. It's mostly Empire swordsmen and Empire spearmen. A pretty even fight for me, whichever one I face, but I've got the numbers advantage, so I should be able to wear them down, provided I don't let their missiles and artillery blast on me too much. Otherwise, we might be too weakened before we even get to them. But we've also got some strong units in our army, some Marauder champions, some trolls. We've got options. We should be just fine with this, as long as we don't let them use their advantage, the good matchups for them, the missiles and artillery. If I were to let them shoot the crap out of my trolls or use their mortars to blow up my Marauder champions, I'll be allowing them too many good matchups for them, too many good ways for them to damage my army with little for me in return. So I need to stop them doing that by disrupting their missiles. So take a look at your next battle. Next time you fight in campaign, don't be afraid to pause the battle or slow it down and take a look at the battles and the matchups that are going on. Is this a good matchup for you? Are you going to win? If not, do something about it. And don't be afraid to simply run away from a bad matchup. If you're about to run into a unit that you know is going to beat the crap out of you, just don't run into them. Just wait and find a better opportunity to use that unit or to let somebody else try to take care of them. Here you can see my dogs chewing on the mortars, stopping them from firing. Got lots of units coming around the flank. I'm still having a row with those pistoliers. But ultimately, I'm able to get more good matchups than my enemy in this campaign battle, so I win. I know I'm sort of making it sound like it's really simple, but there is a lot to it with having to learn all the different units and all the matchups, but the more you play, the more you'll learn to do this. And when you play campaigns, that's kind of what campaigns are good for, because they introduce units to you slowly instead of an entire army all at once. You get to learn the units a little at a time, so just be sure to pay attention to your units and try to learn what they're capable of. Learn their good matchups, learn who they're good at fighting and who they're not good at fighting, the good and bad matchups, and then learn to make predictions to see where you're probably going to win or lose on the battlefield. You're going to lose some matchups some of the time. There's always going to be some bad matchup going on. You can't win them all, but you can win most of them potentially, and that is what wins you the battle. So at this point, we hopefully understand that all factions are different because they have stronger and weaker parts of their army. Units are different because of their stats, creating low, mid and high tier units. These units will have good and bad matchups versus other units from other factions. To win a battle, you simply need to get more good matchups than the other guy. Now let's talk about formations and basic army movement. One of the most important parts of any army is the front line, the units that are going to be the first to crash into the enemy, getting the battle underway. You could come with a more expensive, more elite high tier front line, like these great swords for the Empire, which is all well and good. You'll have a nice strong front line that'll hit hard, but it comes with the downside that they're very expensive and you won't necessarily be able to bring a lot of them, so it'll be a shorter front line. You could opt to go for what we call chaff front lines though, which is just the cheap units. They're not going to do a ton of damage, they're not going to last very long, but they are cheap, so they'll save you money, meaning you can put more money into the rest of your army. Get some better cav or missiles, or perhaps because they're cheap you can simply bring more of them, allowing you a longer front line or just to try and overwhelm the enemy with numbers. Or you may want a front line that can hold a long time and that won't break easily. Usually spear type units are the best at this. In this case we're going to say halberdiers. They've got decent melee defense and they can hold a line pretty well. And they're anti-large, so if any monsters or cav come their way, they're going to be fine. But they might not do so well against infantry. So understand that there's a bunch of different ways you could set up a front line, whether you want it to be punchy and damaging to try and break the enemy front line quickly, or whether you just want them to hold there so you can bring your cavalry around the back to hit them from the rear, or maybe you just want some stuff to kind of get in the way of the enemy while the rest of your army does the bulk of the work. Whatever front line you choose though, you'll need a good strong formation so that all your units can support each other. So let's take a look at a basic formation. If you really don't know where to start, you can use something like this. So of course, we first have our front line as we just spoke about. This could be better or worse, but most of the army will be revolving around this most of the time. It's good to try and space your units out a bit for a few reasons. Number one, it'll widen your front line, making you slightly harder to flank, but the worry is wind spells these days. The AI doesn't really know how to use them too well, but in multiplayer we have to be very careful. If you put your troops in a line, they're probably going to get wind spelled because there's so many around nowadays. And what we need for the protection of the front line is units on the flank. Usually anti-large units are the best for this, things like spears, because very often cavalry and monsters will try to flank you because they're faster, and these units are anti-large, so they're good matchups to take on those large units. And then we have what's called our backline, our missiles and artillery usually. These will need some kind of protection, whether actively with those units or just protecting the flanks. They can do lots of damage to the enemy before they've even arrived at you. And do be sure to consider your front line if you bring a lot of missiles. If you have a weak front line, it might break easily and expose all your missiles to danger. In this case, I'm going to use Karl Franz to buff this front line of swordsmen. So generally swordsmen aren't very strong, but with a little bit of help and melee defense and melee attack buffs from Karl, his aura should help keep these swordsmen a bit better than they normally would be, to protect those missiles. And again, be sure to spread out missiles and artillery so they can all cover each other if need be. And then we have our flanking units. These can either stay back to cover the wing of your front line, or they could push on the enemy and try to get into their front line or deal with their flanking units. You can have this on both sides. Again, you can push, you could pull back and defend if you need to. You could come and attack the enemy front line. There's endless amounts of things you can do. But having this kind of basic formation just helps all the units work together, so when you have those situations where you need to change a bad matchup, you've got someone there to try and help you out. So to reiterate, front line, protection on the flanks of it with some little flanking protection anti-large units. Then you've got your backline, missiles and artillery, they'll need protection too. Flanking units that can either stay back and defend, or they could push out and try to get after the enemy. Same on both sides. You could have it on just one side and load up one side with loads of stuff to flank with. There's just an endless amount of options. This is just one basic way to set up a formation. Like I say, if you don't know where to start, just go for something like this. And as you progress, you can experiment with different things, or you can watch what other people do and try their stuff out. There's a whole bunch of different ways to use formations. Now let me show you a few basic keyboard shortcuts for making moving your army around much easier, because I think a lot of newer players struggle with this, and it can make the game much harder when you don't know how to control the army. So Control A is the first one. Control A will select your entire army, all of your units, everything. Control A is a good way. At the start of the battle, you need to select your entire army to move. Control A is the way to go. Then you can mouse over any of your units, doesn't matter which one, hold down Alt and then left mouse button, drag your mouse around, and you can move the entire formation as it is, and then simply release the left mouse button to give the order. This is the simplest and most efficient way to move your army around quickly. So again, just hover over any unit that you've selected, hold down left mouse button and Alt, and you can move that formation around. If you need to cancel it, you can drag your mouse to the bottom of the screen, or you can press Escape. And obviously you can do that with smaller parts of your army. If you've got just a bit of cav to move up, just Alt, left mouse button, drag, and they'll stay in the same kind of formation that they're in. Another good habit to get into is quick dragging your box to select units. You know, when you drag a box around units like this, do that but super quick. It's one of the keys to getting faster micro. Doesn't take a lot of effort, doesn't take a lot of practice, you just got to get in the habit of it. Quick select, give orders. Quick select, give orders. That's basically how you micro an army. Another useful control to tie on to the Alt left mouse button drag is, while you're doing Alt left mouse button drag, press Control, you can let go of Alt if you want to, and you'll be able to rotate the army on the spot. This is incredibly handy if the enemy army is a bit off to the left or right of you. You can turn to face and rotate them so that your formation is a bit more square with theirs, helping you stay efficient and effective. So, Control A to select your entire army, Alt left mouse button drag to move your army around in the current formation, add on Control to that to rotate, and try to select your units as quickly as possible with the drag box. Make these things habit, and I guarantee they will help you move your army around much more effectively. Now I'm just going to finish up this video with a bit of miscellaneous information that is useful to know in all battles. Firstly, understand the importance of armor piercing. When you look at a unit's weapon strength, you can see its base damage and armor piercing damage. If a unit has way more base damage than it does armor piercing damage, that means it's not so good against heavily armored units. You can tell this by the symbol that is next to the weapon strength. Units that aren't good at taking on armor don't have the little silver symbol. The best matchup for these units is more lightly armored troops, because heavy units will simply negate a lot of their damage. But when a unit does have that armor piercing symbol, such as these Graveguard with great weapons, it tells you that they're going to be better at taking on heavy armor. If you look at their weapon strength, you'll notice their armor piercing damage is much higher than their base damage. This unit can pierce armor well. There's the little silver symbol that tells you a unit is armor piercing. So keep an eye out for that symbol. If you notice an enemy unit has a lot of armor, you're going to need a unit that has that little symbol to take them on. They're going to be the best matchup for them, potentially. because units without that little silver symbol will struggle to do damage through the heavy enemy armor. And the same idea with anti-large units, those with a bonus versus large. These swordsmen don't have that. There's no symbol there to signify it. They're not very good at fighting cavalry or monsters. They're best off fighting infantry. These spearmen though have that little bonus versus large symbol, which tells you this unit is good at fighting large enemies. Cavalry, monsters, chariots, lords on mounts, anything bigger than a human or not infantry basically, they get a bonus to their melee attack and weapon strength, as their melee attack generally isn't very good, so if they fight infantry, they won't do that well. They also have a charge defense against large, which means when something large charges into them, they'll negate the charge bonus, limiting the amount of damage they take, so essentially protecting themselves. The Empire swordsmen don't have this, so they'll feel the full force of a cav charge, for example. So be sure to pay attention to those two things specifically, armor piercing and bonus versus large. These are the main two basic things to look out for in your matchups, and to tell you whether a unit is in a good or bad matchup. If a unit is not anti-large and it's fighting a large unit, probably not going to do so well. If there's an armor piercing unit coming towards your heavily armored unit, you might want to get them out of there because that unit is a good matchup versus yours. These two things are important to look out for. Another important thing to pay attention to in battle is the terrain around you. The hills, the trees, the rocks. You could potentially use these things to gain an advantage over your enemy, but the enemy might do the same to you. As Obi-Wan taught us, high ground is very important. There are actually damage bonuses to be gained from being on the higher ground above your enemy and shooting down on enemies or charging down on enemies. There's advantages to the high ground. Rock formations that may be able to be used to protect one of your flanks. You could position your army to have this big rock formation in the way of the enemy, so they have to go all the way around it to get behind you. That can be used to your advantage. Trees, of course, can hide things in, allowing you some sneaky tactics, or they can slow units down that try to run through them. Or they can protect from missile fire. They can conceal armies trying to avoid artillery damage. There's a whole bunch of use of all kinds of things of the map, so pay attention to them because you might be able to use them. Another important part of any army is magic, something I haven't really mentioned yet you might be wondering about. Quite simply, it's there to turn bad matchups into good ones, or to take out strong enemy units. You can drop an explosion spell on your enemies, you can debuff your enemies, you can buff your allies. It's all about simply giving yourself some kind of advantage. You can get pretty creative with it, but for the most part, simply target the strongest enemy units and try to take them out with your magic. Or if your unit's in a fairly even or losing matchup, give them a buff to turn it around for them. There's a whole bunch of uses. That's a whole nother story for another day. I do have a video on that though. I will link it at the end, obviously. Understand the importance of leadership on the battlefield. Very often it's good to try and break your enemy's leadership and get them running away, rather than trying to kill every single man or rat in the unit. Rout a unit off is much more effective than killing your way through the unit. And sometimes keeping your army in the fight is a matter of controlling your leadership and not letting the enemy break your units too quickly. This can be achieved with good formations, with magic and abilities, and a number of other ways. And when it comes to breaking the enemy leadership, there's one important tactic to go for. Flanking. Simply get behind the enemy and hit them in the back to sandwich them in between two of your units. This makes the unit fight on two fronts, meaning it takes lots of damage, and that adds up to a lot of leadership penalties, meaning that unit will rout and run away quite often. Cavalry are one of the best units to do this. They can cycle charge, which means charging in, hitting the enemy, staying there for 10 to 15 seconds, and then pulling back and doing the same again over and over again until the unit is all but dead. So there you go. A guide to the battles of Total War Warhammer. What it's fundamentally all about. There is a lot to learn, but it simply comes by playing the game. You don't need to sit down and study, just play. Campaigns are a great way to learn units, especially because they introduce them to you slowly. So just get playing and things will come to you naturally. If you want to learn a bunch more stuff, here's all of these videos to take a look at. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the future.